Hi, this is Now Presenting ADHD, where we look at common ways attention deficit hyperactivity disorder can present in individuals, explain what the root causes can be, and connect the experience to real humans. I'm your host, Jaye. I'm an ADHD coach, instructor, and generally nice person. Just a little over a week ago, I presented a talk at the International Conference on ADHD in Dallas. My talk, The Importance and Impact of Proud Self-Disclosure, takes an empowering perspective to something that is often presented as something scary and detrimental. As someone who has only benefited from disclosure, I wanted to show others that disclosure can create wonderful change in many aspects of our lives. Afterward, people told me they wished the talk was available to their friends, family members, and others who couldn't be at the conference. So instead of the usual Now Presenting ADHD episode, I'll be reciting my talk again for all of you at home. A link to the slides, which contain the script to this talk and episode in the speaker notes, can be found on our website at npadhd.com. It's probably strange to deviate from the format in the second episode and not have any guests, but hey, I started this podcast to bring a different perspective to ADHD conversations, and this talk is no exception. All right, friends, now presenting ADHD and the importance and impact of proud self-disclosure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jaye. Thank you so much for coming to my talk on the importance and impact of proud self-disclosure. The first half of my talk will be informative and focus on what we can gain from disclosing our ADHD. I'll answer the following questions. What does disclosure mean? How could disclosure benefit us? How does disclosure benefit the ADHD community? And how does disclosure benefit the overall community? The second half will focus on actionable things we can do in order to have positive and successful disclosure experiences. These questions will be answered. How can we confront our anxieties about disclosure? How can we prepare for more positive disclosure experiences? And how can we support our peers in their disclosure journeys? I'll start with an introduction to who I am and my journey with ADHD. I'll also be interspersing my own experiences with disclosure as it applies to each subject as we go. My name is Jaye, and I'm an ADHD coach, ADHD instructor, and ADHD human. Although my legal name is Jennifer Lynn, I go by Jaye in my personal and professional life. I trained as an ADHD coach with ADCA, or the ADD Coaching Academy, while I was working as an administrative business partner at Google. After completing my ADHD coaching training, I became Google's first and only ADHD-trained peer coach, completing over 80 hours coaching other ADHD Googlers as a 20% project. I left Google in April of this year to start my own coaching practice and to create a virtual interactive and peer-supported learning program for ADHD individuals. The learning program is titled Now Presenting ADHD, and the third and final developmental stage of it will be launching in January. I created the program with the intent to also pitch to companies as a way to deliver ADHD knowledge quickly so their ADHD communities can support themselves with peer coaching. To create the content needed for the learning program, I also trained to be an e-learning instructional designer through the University of Washington, finishing the graduate certificate program this past June. Lastly, I just launched a podcast based on some of the topics I teach in my learning program, which, like my learning program, is called Now Presenting ADHD. Now that the professional qualifications are out of the way, here's a little about me as a person. I was born in Southern California to Taiwanese American immigrants, but primarily grew up in San Jose, California, where I lived for most of my life. During the pandemic, I moved to Portland, Oregon before settling where I reside now in Bothell, a suburb in the Seattle, Washington area. I have a 4.5-pound Yorkie who is the love of my life. Arlo is a 1.5 years old and is the cutest boy in the whole world. For free time, I like cooking and baking, which utilizes the skills from my old culinary school degree, and I also love karaoke, trivia, and board games, although I'm mostly bad at the last two. So, what does disclosure mean? As a basic definition, disclosure is the act of making something known. So in this context, we are making our ADHD known to others, which is simple in theory, but rather complex in emotional preparation, logistical planning, and execution. Paired with our greater difficulties with executive function and emotional regulation, the act of disclosure can feel overwhelming and intimidating to many of us. If we break down disclosure into different categories of preparation, it gets much easier to approach. To do this, I use our trusty general information gathering questions of who, what, where, when, and why. I'll go deeper into this later on in the presentation. But before we go on, here is my ADHD and disclosure story. I was diagnosed with ADHD in 2019 in my mid-30s. This is what my life was like before my diagnosis. I was a former gifted child, but my focus in grades started tanking in the 5th grade, coinciding with puberty, a common occurrence with girls with ADHD. This created a lot of conflict in my Taiwanese American home, especially since my parents were both excellent students with advanced degrees, and they made a lot of sacrifices in order for us to live within the borders of one of the highest performing high schools in the country. They would look at my 90-plus percentile standardized testing scores from the year before, reason that I was lazy and undisciplined, and double down on the tough love and shame the same way their parents did with them. While this didn't lead to my grades improving much, it did lead to generalized anxiety and panic disorders. I was an emotional minefield. So many years of shame led to constant self-loathing. I was intensely critical of myself, and in turn, anyone who seemed to be less talented than I was. I was also very emotionally reactive, explosively so. Let's just say I did not take negative feedback like a champ. I had multiple careers before my diagnosis, first in the hospitality industry, owning a food truck and restaurant, then doing customer service and inside sales, project management, then administrative work, most recently at Google, as I mentioned earlier. I constantly bounced from job to job, alternating from thinking this role was going to be everything and change my life, only to leave at the height of burnout. My job at Google was the first where I had stayed in a company for more than 2 years, which honestly wouldn't have happened had I not gotten my ADHD diagnosis. I was a constant work burnout and a constant emotional burnout. I was at my standard burnout point at Google a little over a year into my stint there when my lead AVP, a non-managing supervisor, suggested I take a breather before I truly decide to quit. I agreed, and she pulled me off my team to get my head back on straight, go to therapy, and generally do the work required to sustain my career at Google. I went to a new therapist who asked what I wanted to work on. I rattled off a list of what I consider to be personality flaws. I have 2 modes, unsustainable sprint and burnout, or not being able to do anything productive. I was always blurting and regretting. I'm emotionally explosive. I tend to steamroll other people if I want something bad enough, even if they're the ones leading the project. I want to do everything and don't want to stop volunteering for things I care about, even if I'm stretched thin. I'm constantly towing the line where anxiety meets panic, and I'm constantly concerned that everyone must hate me. In the interest of time, I will stop there. You get the picture. After I was done naming everything I hated about myself, this new therapist calmly asked me if I had ever had a thorough assessment for ADHD. I said I brought it up with my previous therapist, who told me I couldn't possibly have ADHD because I was in an administrative role. My new therapist said that doesn't mean anything and referred me to a local clinic that specializes in adult ADHD to get a thorough assessment. She said it's possible I have ADHD and it's possible I don't, but the assessment will inform us on how to approach treatment. Well, after a thorough assessment from Dr. Lawrence Choi from the Elite Focus Clinic in Los Altos, I was diagnosed with combined type ADHD, and treatment began. I started on stimulant medication and was also given a starter set of resources and recommendations on multimodal ADHD treatment, including therapy, coaching, meditation, nutrition, and sleep studies based on my unique needs. I wanted to share my disclosure with the people around me, but I felt that it was important to do it in a thoughtful way. I consulted with my team's HR business partner, whom I considered a friend, being the admin for my team. She said everything about the disclosure process would be my personal choice, but she suggested I do an official disclosure to the company early on because it would come in handy if I had to take mental health leaves or get extra accommodation resources. And so I did. Next, I disclosed to my manager and the other executives I supported as an admin. Around the same time, I disclosed to my ABP teammates individually in our scheduled one-on-one sessions or in workplace social gatherings. The response from everyone was the same. They said they were happy I felt comfortable sharing this journey with them and asked how they could support me. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful and connected to my peers, instead of quietly feeling out of place and not enough. In my personal life, I disclosed to my then partner, whom I was living with at the time. He was also supportive, although he didn't really have a clue what it meant. Then my close friends, then a wider group of friends if I was already engaging with them, and lastly, my family. I shared with my sister first because she was already aware and supportive of my mental health struggles, and I had an inkling she would be accepting of it, which she was. I decided not to tell my parents about my ADHD in the beginning. At the time, I was struggling pretty hard with everything work and life had to bring, and I didn't want to make them feel like they failed me or that my suffering was due to their ignorance or neglect. This was actually the topic of a few sessions with my therapist, and through that, I made the decision to hold off on telling them, because I couldn't articulate what I wanted to get from letting them know. All of my disclosure conversations went even better than I expected. At worst, people said, "Okay, cool," and life went on as normal. At best, I was able to get really great insight into ADHD and talk through what it meant for me, connecting us deeper. Almost everyone around me shifted their behavior to accommodate and support me. There were far less jokes about traits that could be attributed to ADHD. They allowed me to articulate what my needs were and create the schedule and working style that I could adhere to with less cognitive effort. And in general, I just felt like they were seeing me for what I brought to the table, instead of advising me on how others do a task or project. I have to admit that how I felt more connected to my peers probably had more to do with me and less to do with their overt attitudes and actions, which I'll touch on later as well. My work performance really started to do a 180. Medication helped me be aware of the limitations I had as an undiagnosed ADHD individual and definitely gave me a boost in executive function and emotional regulation. But I also started approaching work with how to make things work for me, instead of feeling like I had to prove something to everyone, including myself. I started taking on a reasonable workload, delegating tasks to others, teaching others to do things for themselves instead of always doing it for them, and generally saying no to things that were out of my bandwidth, both in time and cognitive energy. I went from barely getting a performance rating of consistently meets expectations, or CME, the lowest acceptable rating in the you aren't in danger of losing your job range, to getting a promotion within 2 performance cycles, the absolute minimum amount of time it takes to get a promotion from a CME. Considering my diagnosis and disclosure came 4 months before the COVID-19 pandemic, this was an even more spectacular feat. More importantly, I was able to feel at ease and confident at my job and in life for the first time in a long time, maybe ever. As my star at work began to rise, I decided not to keep this to myself anymore. I submitted my experience on an inquiry for Google's West Coast Admin Summit and was asked to participate on their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion panel to share my experience with neurodiversity. That panel, which was broadcasted to 700 ABPs, was the start of my ADHD advocacy work. In it, I shared my experience with ADHD and how my diagnosis and disclosure to my team wasn't just beneficial to me, but to my team as well. Pairing the majority of my team's high executive function with my creative, inquisitive, and entrepreneurial way of working made the team as a whole so much stronger. Together, we were bigger than the sum of our parts. After that panel, the outpour of feedback was intense, and it took me several days to respond to all the pings and emails. ABPs thanked me for sharing my experience in general because they had no idea there could be people around them struggling in that way. Some ABPs said they broke down in tears because they resonated with my experience, and they had since lined up appointments for ADHD assessments. Some ABPs told me they have ADHD and never felt comfortable disclosing it to their team before, and now they think they will. As someone who has always felt insignificant and unable to create positive change in my communities, this result felt shocking to me and also really, really fulfilling. I decided to keep going. A few months later, I co-founded and started co-leading the ADHD Women at Google Employee Resource Group, which provided a structure for women and non-binary Googlers to gather, seek, or give advice, and validate our experiences together. In the same month as I finished my ADHD coaching training and became Google's first and only ADHD trained peer coach, I, along with my ADHD Women at Google co-lead, was a speaker at the Alphabet Mental Health Conference, which was broadcasted to the entire company's employees. Over 100,000 of them. Our talk, Create the Communities You Wish to Have, gave an introduction to ADHD, how women can experience it differently, why it's important for our ERG to also exist, how we did it, and how others can follow our lead to create the communities they seek to support them. With every public speaking appearance, the responses reflected the ones I received in my first DEI panel. Those who were silently struggling were finally aware that ADHD might be a factor. Those who remained quiet about their ADHD felt confident and empowered to disclose, and those who had no idea about neurodiversity were able to see working with others in a completely different light. My managers and team members supported me at every venture. My teammates cheered me on from the sidelines and were constantly happy reminders that my neurodiversity makes me an asset, not a liability. And as I started openly discussing my ADHD on social media accounts, I saw similar responses. Overwhelming support. Enough about me for the time being. Let's get to the meat of disclosure. How could disclosure benefit us? No talk on disclosure is complete without talking about legal benefits of disclosure. Of course, this is United States-based, but similar protections exist in some other countries as well. The Americans with Disability Act covers individuals with ADHD in the workplace and in schools. With official ADHD disclosure, you have a right to certain accommodations, and disclosing can make an easier path to additional benefits, such as subsidized therapy, coaching, and medical leaves, depending on the work or school organization. There are also repercussions against discrimination, such as a manager giving the report less impactful projects after learning about their ADHD when their work history shows they turn in good work on time. There are limitations to ADA protections, as it's only applicable for companies with 15 or more employees. Very small businesses are not required to adhere to ADA laws, although local jurisdictions may have similar rules in place for smaller organizations. And like anything else, filing claims and lawsuits against an organization's ADA violations can be a long process and unfriendly to ADHD and executive dysfunction. For that reason, my focus on the benefits of disclosure is on the aspects outside of legal reasons. So let's talk about what happens when we don't disclose. When those around us don't know we are neurodivergent and we don't tell them what our needs are, we can be held to neurotypical standards. Incorrect assumptions can be made about us based on what those actions would mean coming from that particular person or a neurotypical. For example, if we have trouble with blurting or interrupting, this could signal to another person that we think our thoughts and opinions are more important than theirs. After all, they might only blurt and interrupt someone if they aren't interested in what the other person has to say. But our blurting and interrupting has more to do with a racing mind and impulse control, and less about whether we value another person's opinion. Or, a very common scenario, when our project is past due and not yet complete, it can be assumed that it's a project we are not interested in, when the very opposite can be true. We are not blind to these assumptions, and it typically doesn't feel good to us. So a common way we address this is to mask. Masking is when we try to cover up the symptoms of our ADHD by mimicking the actions of someone who doesn't have it. Some common examples of masking ADHD are sustaining long periods of eye contact or visual focus, forcing ourselves to sit still against our urges to fidget or move, and creating a huge amount of anxiety and shame in order to force us to complete what we need to in the moment. Masking uses a huge cognitive load, which is taxing on our already limited working memory. Raise your hand if you've ever tried to visibly sustain your focus during a conversation, and doing so made it harder to actually pay attention to what the other person was saying. So with that limited cognitive bandwidth being used to pretend we don't have ADHD, some pretty detrimental things can happen. As I mentioned, we can have a reduced focus on important things. While we are signaling to another person that we are listening, we may not be able to actually listen. They may be aware of that when they ask us a question, and we have to admit that we don't know what they were just saying. Raise your hand if that's ever happened to you. We can feel worn out. After all, if I used up all my cognitive energy pretending not to have ADHD, what do I have left to execute on complex planning and tasks? Raise your hand if you've ever sat through a bunch of meetings or classes and then went home and were unable to do anything productive. It's also possible to have our mask slip, especially when we've run out of cognitive energy. Raise your hand if you've ever noticed yourself unable to stop blurting, fidgeting, or zoning out toward the end of a long work or school day. Lastly, we can feel a sense of distrust of ourselves and of others. We can't count on ourselves to mask 100% of the time, and we can't afford to leave the mask off because of our distrust of how others will perceive us. I'll say it again for those in the back. When we don't allow others to see us as we are without the mask, it means we don't fully trust them to support and accept us. Disclosure can help with this. If they know about our ADHD and how it presents, it's more likely for them to have accurate interpretations of our actions. We can also get some of our cognitive bandwidth back when we are not masking, so we can use it on other things, like managing our emotions or getting our work done. Disclosure can also mean others can help us along by doing small things that benefit us. I asked my project mate to talk through logistical processes with me in our meetings because it's easy for me to talk through it and harder for me to work it out on my own. It's also easier to ask for others to body double, or the definition of that, to work quietly on things together, even if it's different things. When others know about our ADHD, we're giving them the chance to stand up and support us. This can also lead to advocating for us. A great example of this is when my friends throw parties and allow for a quiet room for me to retreat to when I'm feeling overstimulated. It's no longer something I need to explicitly ask for because they know what my needs are and are happy to advocate for them. When we allow others to understand who we are and show their support, we strengthen the connection we have with them instead of feeling isolated in hiding our true selves. Some people listening to this may still be on the fence because it sounds like disclosure only improves our own lives and not the lives of anyone else. Well, as mentioned in my disclosure story, that's not accurate. So let's first discuss how disclosure benefits the ADHD community. As you all know by this point, I'm a complete open book about ADHD. I post about it on social media accounts, including LinkedIn. I give public talks, and I proudly list my job as an ADHD coach. Here are ways this has created impact for the ADHD community around me. My public disclosure of ADHD has led many peers, friends, and family members to discover their own ADHD and neurodiversity. Since I was diagnosed in my mid-30s, I'm living proof that the often uttered sentence, "If I had ADHD, I would know it by now," does not necessarily apply. Describing my experience has led to an estimated 50 people in my circle getting their own diagnoses, especially in minority groups and amongst women, who are able to get by in life but with a heaping helping of debilitating anxiety. There are also many people who have credited hearing me talk about my ADHD to them being confident enough to have their own disclosure experiences. Mine and others' safe disclosure stories gave them assurance that the environment can be safe and beneficial for disclosure, which I'm happy to report has led to more positive disclosure experiences. Many of them have also attributed that safe disclosure push to them leading more fulfilling and happy lives. I hear a lot of feedback on how taking off their mask allowed them to have the energy to not only thrive, but to soar. And for those who are still not comfortable disclosing their ADHD to others, my outward ADHD disclosure allows them to feel safe in approaching me to have conversations about their ADHD. Because everyone knows about my ADHD, I have become a safe ally and resource that they would not have had otherwise. A lot of people look at where I am in life, and it gives them hope for their future. And by that, I don't mean look at how much success, money, or fame I have. I mean that after my diagnosis, I've worked through the shame and self-loathing that plagued me my entire life, and now love the person that I am and feel that I am enough. I did spend a session with my therapist last year where I brought up the pressure I felt about being a role model for others in the ADHD community. I thought, I can't afford to fail and have to keep pushing myself to be bigger and more. I'm supposed to be a symbol of who they could be. But then I realized that to be a role model, it wouldn't help anyone for me to create more pressure and anxiety to achieve at astronomical levels. It would actually help them to see that I can be vulnerable. To see me tell my team, I think there's too much on my plate, and to see if someone else is interested in taking on one of my projects. to even set a boundary by telling someone that I can't take on more peer clients even though I want to help, because my bandwidth is full and I want to make sure I avoid burnout. As an ADHD role model, I find the best I can do is to show others that it's safe to be fallible and human. Disclosure, both publicly and somewhat privately, can create ripple effects in the ADHD community around us. For example, one of my ADHD women at Google ERG members had kept her ADHD a secret from everyone but her husband for 10 years and decided to fully disclose her ADHD shortly after joining our ERG community. She even listed her ADHD and her participation in our ERG openly on her team's Get to Know Me page. She has become an additional beacon of hope for living with ADHD, and it's a ripple that came from my own disclosure. I've been told by a lot of people that hearing me talk about my ADHD changed their lives. A lot have mentioned that they were scared of disclosure or ashamed of their ADHD until they met me and asked how I was able to be so brave about my disclosure so quickly. What I tell them is the truth. When I was diagnosed, I didn't feel any shame about my ADHD because I'm already the second ripple. This is Margot Jaffe. If any of you know her, you probably feel as lucky as I do. She recently left the corporate world after being incredibly successful in marketing and disability positions to co-found her own professional ADHD development program, The Great ADHD Reset. Margot was also diagnosed with ADHD well into adulthood at age 29. In 2015, she started Kaleidoscope Society, an online resource and community for girls and women with ADHD. And in 2017, she founded the Neurodiversity ERG at Yahoo, where she was a head of a marketing department, then a director. Shortly after she started the Neurodiversity ERG, my team moved to the Sunnyvale Yahoo campus. I joined the Neurodiversity ERG because they welcomed people with generalized anxiety disorder, which was something I definitely had. The Neurodiversity ERG exposed me to a lot of information about ADHD before I even knew I had it. There was a lot of sharing from members who had debilitating anxiety and depression for their entire lives, who had been diagnosed with ADHD and were finally able to live full lives. Margot herself had spoken openly about the topic. There were talks from ADHD industry experts that highlighted the gifts ADHD can bring and how it can be managed. One of the highest powered VPs in the company even did a talk about their ADHD and how it, when he was able to start managing it, is his greatest superpower. Without Margot and the Neurodiversity ERG, I probably wouldn't have gotten such a compassionate view of ADHD before my diagnosis. When others talk about their experiences with undiagnosed ADHD, their stories resonated with me immensely. And when the VP talked about discovering his ADHD in his late 30s and having it be like the ending of The Usual Suspects when he was able to see all these life memories with another perspective, I think I gasped out loud. At the time, I brought it up to my therapist, but I allowed this incompatible, tough love therapist to shame me out of seeking a diagnosis, trusting that she was right and I couldn't possibly have ADHD because I'm in an admin role, and that I was just searching for something else it could be instead of working on my anxiety. Either way, the seed was planted. ADHD is not something to be ashamed of. Okay, so we covered how ADHD disclosure can benefit ourselves and the ADHD community, but what about everyone else? Turns out our disclosure can benefit them as well. Remember when I talked about how without disclosure, others can have incorrect assumptions about what our behaviors mean? Well, that can have negative effects on them as well. If I forget to regularly keep in touch with a friend of mine because my ADHD affects me in that way, it can make them feel like they aren't important to me, which makes them feel bad, even if it isn't true. I won't list more examples because I've already done that, but the point is that with disclosure, others can feel more appreciated and safe in their interactions with us because they can make more accurate assumptions of what our behaviors mean. Also, our success can mean their success. If I'm able to get through my projects quickly, I'm more able to help out my colleagues who might be in a situation where everything happens all at once. And if I'm collaborating on a project, if I'm able to do my part, it means the collective goal is more able to be reached. And if I'm able to get all of my work done in a workday without being utterly exhausted, I'm more likely to be present and pleasant to others in my personal life. Next, being ourselves without masking can fill gaps in skill sets and interests. My out-of-the-box ideas, eye for novel experiences, problem-solving mentality, and empathy are also benefits to the overall community and complemented the skill set of my neurotypical peers who were able to crunch through tons of tedious tasks without issue. Awareness of neurodiversity leads to general empathy and acceptance of all of our differences. I had some neurotypical peers around me who had quirks that they stopped feeling bad about once they saw me openly express mine. As unique individuals in a community, it can often be pressuring to be normal. Showing acceptance for openly neurodivergent individuals can signal to everyone, even neurotypicals, that we are all worthy exactly as we are. And our ADHD disclosure can make us a great resource for peers engaging with other neurodivergents. My friends and peers regularly ask me for advice and insight on how to interact and support their neurodivergent children, friends, partners, and coworkers. Despite hearing about all the benefits that can come from disclosure, I'm guessing a lot of you still have hesitations and anxieties about disclosing. That's totally normal. After living through painful experiences paired with emotional dysregulation and rejection sensitivity dysphoria, the idea of doing something that can make us feel pain again can feel overwhelming. While it's very possible to power through and disclose despite the anxiety, this has the potential to put us in a highly emotional and aggravated state, which can have negative effects on disclosure discussions and our perceptions of it. Here are some ways we can get clarity on our disclosure anxieties and work our way through them. We can examine our anxieties and identify distortions by asking ourselves questions around those anxieties. Here are a few that I like. What negative outcome are you scared of? What evidence do you have that this will happen? A way to narrow this down further in the context of disclosing ADHD to someone is to ask, what actions has this person displayed that makes you believe they will react this way? A lot of my coaching clients say they feel scared to disclose to their manager because they feel like they will perceive or treat them differently if they know about their ADHD. When I ask what about their manager's behavior signals to them that this is how they would react, the vast majority of the time they can't think of anything. In fact, they realize that their manager's behavior actually signals that they would be receptive and supportive of disclosure. They expected a negative outcome from disclosure when there was no evidence, which was a distortion. Then ask yourself, what positive outcome can come out of this disclosure? Maybe they will be supportive. Maybe this will allow them the opportunity to understand us. Between the positive and negative outcomes, which is more likely? And again, use evidence. It can always feel like negative outcomes are more likely, but what does their behavior support? Then ask, what positive outcomes will you miss out on if you don't disclose? Will keeping your ADHD a secret lead to more masking and high anxiety living? Will not disclosing feel isolating? At this point, there are situations where even for those of us who are comfortable disclosing, the choice is made not to. The negatives outweigh the positives. If your manager has a history of toxic behavior and creating tough work situations for other members of your team, then fearing the outcomes of disclosure is not a distortion, and it may not be safe to disclose. If you have a mean uncle who is constantly ranting about how ADHD is not real and there's no way to change his mind, well, he sucks, and it might not be worth it to disclose to him. I'm not trying to gaslight anyone into thinking disclosure is always safe and the anxieties about it are unfounded. Sometimes people suck. Sometimes negative outcomes happen. But more often than not, ADHD individuals talk themselves out of disclosure when the environment is actually very safe for them to disclose. If the idea of approaching the questions on the last slide feels overwhelming to do on your own, my advice is don't do it on your own. We ADHD folk tend to be verbal processors with lower working memory. Having someone ask these questions for us can make it easier for us to come up with the answers. It's also less likely that we will bail on this exploration process because we're overwhelmed and uncomfortable. Here are ways you can safely explore disclosure anxieties through connection. There are ADHD support groups to join. These can happen in person or virtually, and there are many providers which vary from region to region. You can also talk through your anxieties and work through these questions with trusted friends and family members, assuming some disclosure has already happened. And you can talk about these anxieties with other people with ADHD in other settings. Friends with ADHD, family members with ADHD, other people at this conference. Make ADHD connections. They are more than worth it. The downside to exploration with peers is that sometimes these environments can lead us to strengthening our distortions instead of taking a more objective look to them. I mean, it makes sense. Our friends and family members are there to support us. If I tell my friend my boss is a jerk, she would be on my side and say, he sucks. She wouldn't ask about other ways his actions could be interpreted or explore whether this particular brand of jerk I find my boss to be would make for an unsafe disclosure environment. To be honest, I might not want her to. I might just want her to be on my side. And just like other environments where anxieties grow stronger in a group, pairing two ADHD individuals who are scared of disclosure together reinforces the fear instead of dispelling it. For that reason, I think the safest, most productive ways to explore disclosure situation anxieties are through professionals. Talk through it with a therapist or an ADHD coach. We act as a third-party support structure, allowing you to explore all the aspects of how you're feeling without any risk to your personal relationships. Okay, so how can we prepare for more positive disclosures? In my client sessions, once the anxieties of disclosure are worked through, I can see their body language change. Once empowered to disclose, they look lighter and more energized. And then I ask them what they want to say. 10 out of 10, they don't really know, or they confidently start talking, then stop and say something like, wait, no, that's not right. The same thing happened for me, actually. After my diagnosis, I decided to disclose to my manager. I told him I was just diagnosed with ADHD. He said he felt honored that I felt comfortable disclosing to him, then asked what my needs were and how he could support me. I froze because I didn't know. I blurted out that maybe I could use a wobble stool, which he approved on the spot. I ended up not even really using that $300 wobble stool, then feeling uncomfortable asking for anything else since I wasted a bunch of money. Judging from my discussions with other ADHD individuals, this is a common scenario. So, to figure out what we want to prepare for our disclosure discussions, we can consult our trusty information gathering questions of who, what, where, when, and why. These are questions we can ask ourselves to figure out our intentions and take this disclosure thing one step at a time. Disclosure decisions are personal choices, and comfort levels vary from person to person. It's important to be true to ourselves when answering these questions and not rely on another person's disclosure choice as a guide. Let's start with who to disclose to. Most of the time when people talk about disclosure, the focus is on the workplace. For that, there are a wide range of disclosure levels that can happen. Do you have an official company disclosure through the HR department? Do you disclose your ADHD to your manager or supervisor? How about your team? Your peers outside the team? And often overlooked in disclosure discussions are personal disclosure conversations. The most commonly disclosed to individual in someone's life is their spouse or partner. Friends and family members can be audiences of disclosure and in varying levels within those groups as well, like with only close friends and immediate family members. At the end of the spectrum is everyone else. There's no right or wrong order to disclose your ADHD to those around you. For example, I disclosed to my workplace before I disclosed to friends and family. I was even doing talks and panels before I disclosed to my parents, which I mentioned earlier. While some individuals might have hurt feelings over other people knowing before they do, your decisions will ultimately depend on your goals and your comfort levels, and just moving forward can be more empowering and helpful than doing everything in the optimum order. Okay, next, what do we disclose other than the fact that we have ADHD? We can explain to them what ADHD is and how it affects us. While times are definitely changing and ADHD is starting to be a more compassionately viewed topic, we can't assume that everyone will know what ADHD is and how it presents within us. This is especially the case for individuals who are inattentive type or those who have covered up symptoms with things like anxiety and other coping mechanisms. I often hear complaints from others that their ADHD disclosure led their manager to assume something that was untrue about them, like they would be late to important events when being late is not something that affects them. If we want to prevent assumptions that others make of us because of the ADHD disclosure, it can be very important to inform them on how our ADHD tends to present. Also, what are our needs? As I mentioned, I made the mistake of asking for a wobble stool because it's a common thing that helps people with ADHD. But it does not really help me because I prefer to sit crisscross applesauce, and can't do that in a wobble chair. A more ideal chair for me would be a cross-legged stool or a regular desk chair. Figure out what works for you. Then ask yourself what accommodations you want to ask for that will help you get your needs met. Again, this varies for every person. An example of my specific needs and asks are that I need to be able to focus on one thing at a time. So I told my manager and peers that I might take up to a half an hour to get back to them on their pings and emails because I need to group tasks together, and if I'm answering pings as they come in, I'll never get anything done. Next, what support would you like them to give you? What actions can they take to make your life easier with ADHD? Subsequently, how do you work best with others? Do you like more frequent milestones and check-ins? Do you like having a dashboard to signal to your manager where you are at every instance to avoid on-the-spot conversations? All these answers vary from person to person, even with ADHD, and it's important to communicate how you work best in order to reasonably expect it from your manager and peers. Lastly, what strategies are we implementing in order to manage our ADHD? This piece signals that we are actively working on our ADHD struggles and that we're a work in progress. For those who are worried that their ADHD disclosure can be seen as an excuse, sharing upcoming strategies can reverse that effect. We are encountering challenges and we're actively doing something about it. It can also create feelings of accountability when we say it out loud and let others know about it. Up next is where. Where do we disclose? What environment do you want the disclosure to happen? One-on-one meetings are really great for initial disclosure, especially if you want to feel out their response before opening your disclosure out to more people. In-person disclosure is probably the best option, but if that's not something that can happen immediately due to geographical differences, I also recommend video calls for this kind of thing. Mainly because it can be a nerve-wracking experience, and if you're prone to interpreting pauses in conversation as something more, being able to observe multiple areas of social cues can feel more comforting than speaking over the phone or audio only. There are also wider disclosure announcements, which can happen typically when initial disclosures are out of the way. My best friend may want to have more in-depth conversations about my ADHD during disclosure, but won't feel comfortable doing so if I disclose to everyone I'm Facebook friends with at the same time. Considering the disclosure conversations can create more intimacy and connection, doing one big announcement right from the jump can rob us of those connection-filled conversations. If needed, writing a letter can be an option if the idea of disclosure is so uncomfortable we can't approach conversations. I typically don't recommend it if conversations are possible because it removes the conversation piece from disclosure. The other person isn't given the option to respond and even to openly show their support. This approach has the potential to make us feel more isolated and anxious. But for those where this is the only way forward, it can be much better than nothing. Now the piece that arguably makes everyone the most nervous. When do we disclose? To that, I say, as soon as you can. I often ask ADHD individuals who haven't disclosed at work why they're putting it off. The most common answers are, I don't think I need to. I'm doing fine at work right now. And I'm worried they'll think it's an excuse. To that, I usually respond that that's the best time to disclose. You're worried they'll think your ADHD is an excuse? An excuse for what? You're doing well at work. Disclosure at this point can signal that you're trying to elevate your productivity to the next level. Another common thing that is said is, I don't have all the answers. That's valid. The what do we disclose slide I just showed is hefty, but the good news is you don't actually have to have all the answers right away. A very acceptable starting disclosure thing to say is, I'm working out what my needs are and what accommodations would help me. I'll share them with you once I figure it out. And depending on the organization, this initial conversation might lead to more resources for you to figure those things out, like company-subsidized learning programs, ADHD coaching, and company accommodation experts. Hopefully this alleviates the overwhelm that can come from approaching disclosure conversations. As a whole, if you're hesitant to disclose right now, ask yourself why it's not the right time. Sometimes the answers can be valid. As I mentioned, I didn't disclose to my parents until over 6 months after my diagnosis because I didn't want them to feel like I was blaming them for my inability to succeed for so many years, because at the time I was in a pretty deep hole. By the time I disclosed to them, I had turned my life around and had told them I was working on my ADHD and that I was thriving. I will never be 100% sure, but I feel like that approach led them to be more supportive and open to discussing my ADHD. The why is something I covered in my slides about what disclosure is, but it's worth repeating. Disclosure reduces distortions of others' assumptions of us, gives us cognitive bandwidth back from masking, allows others to help us with small actions, support, and advocate for us, and creates connection instead of isolation. For the ADHD and overall community, disclosure also creates awareness of ADHD in undiagnosed individuals, gives them exposure to safe disclosure stories, allows them to find a safe ally and resource, and gives them an example of ADHD acceptance and success. Even our neurotypical peers can have more accurate assumptions of our behaviors, which benefit them as well. Our success can mean their success, especially when we fill gaps in skill sets and interests. And neurodiversity leads to general empathy of differences in all humans, and being open about our ADHD allows us to be resources with all peers engaging with other neurodivergence. Your own why answers around disclosure will vary. When approaching why, feel free to come up with your own. Here in our journey is where we talk extras. For those who have disclosed or are about to disclose, how can we support our peers in their disclosure journeys? We can provide a safe resource for ADHD so our peers can verbally work out their frustrations and fears around disclosure. Many of us with ADHD are verbal processors, and being able to talk through our feelings and assumptions can be enlightening. In fact, this is the most beneficial piece I see in ADHD coaching. The most important thing we can do is to trust that they are capable in coming up with their own decisions and actions. After all, we ADHD folk tend to not like being told what to do. It's much more empowering when we determine our actions and needs ourselves. We may see the benefit of disclosing and think their lives would be much better if they do, but pressuring them into disclosing when they aren't yet ready is not helpful. In fact, it can be detrimental. Any feelings of inadequacy and anxiety around disclosure can create more resistance and make the process more daunting. If we want to be helpful, we can share our own disclosure stories without creating more pressure for them to do the same. We're all different individuals, and I would never expect others to have the same disclosure attitudes and methods as I do. We can also ask them if there's anything we can do to help them with the disclosure process and allow them to ask us for what they need. This can be role-playing and allowing them to practice what they are going to say. This can be cheerleading and giving them words of affirmation and encouragement. And this can be celebrating with them once disclosure is done. By allowing them to tell us what would be helpful, we are giving them the empowerment to approach their own disclosure journeys. After all, as with all things ADHD related, we are in the best place to approach hard things when we feel confident, prepared, supported, and empowered. That's the end of the importance and impact of proud self-disclosure. If you found this episode enjoyable or informative, please tell your friends and family members with ADHD and/or give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to view slides and talk transcripts, find out more about me, Jaye, or give suggestions on future episodes, please go to our website, npadhd.com. That's the acronym for Now Presenting ADHD, npadhd.com. Or you can follow us on Instagram at npadhd, or me at Jaylin FTW. That's JAYELIN FTW. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.